Alexander Graham Bell, a Scottish scientist, inventor, engineer, and inventor of the first real telephone, was born on March 3, 1847, in Edinburgh, the second child of Alexander Melville Bell, a speech teacher, and Eliza Grace Simons, a pianist who was hard of hearing. Bell had an uncanny ability to solve problems. Even at an early age, Alexander demonstrated a natural curiosity about his world, collecting botanical specimens and presenting his findings. His best friend was Ben Herdman, a neighboring family who ran a flour mill that had been subject to many raids. Young Alexander asked what needed to be done at the mill. He was told to separate the wheat from its husks through the laborious process, and at the age of 12, Bell built a homemade device, which, combined with a few nail brushes, turned into a simple tool that separated the wheat from its husks and was put into operation and used continuously for years. In return, John Herdman gave Alexandra a small workshop for his invention. Bell was deeply affected by his mother's gradual deafness, which began when he was 12 years old. He learned sign language and thus sat next to his mother and quietly explained the family's conversations to her. He also developed a clear speech technique. Bell's concern for his mother's deafness led him to study acoustics. Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, was actually trying to end the silence of the deaf. After being educated at home and attending a private school for a year, Bell attended the Royal High School in Edinburgh, but eventually dropped out because he did not enjoy the compulsory curriculum. Despite a strained relationship with his father, he was greatly influenced by his grandfather and grandmother, who devoted their careers to sound mechanics and diction. Bell followed in their footsteps and became a teacher for the hearing impaired. After his elder brother Merville James and brother Edward Charles died of tuberculosis, Bell and his family moved to Ontario, Canada in 1870 in search of a healthier climate. A year later, Bell, who went to America, started teaching at the Boston School for the Hearing and Speech Impaired and similar facilities in the region. As a teacher, he met 15-year-old Mabel Hubbard, one of his deaf students. Despite the 10-year age difference between them, they fell in love and got married in 1877. The couple had 2 daughters, Elsie and Marion, and 2 sons who died in infancy. Despite Arten's growing fame, Bell never ignored his wife or the hearing impaired. In a letter he wrote to his wife, he wrote, "No matter what position your husband reaches, no matter how rich he is, be sure that he will always think about the hearing impaired and their problems." Most of his works, which are overshadowed by his outstanding inventions today, were in the field of hearing impairment. He managed to record sounds that his hearing-impaired mother and husband could not hear. While teaching the disabled, Bell was asked by a group of investors, including his father-in-law Gardner Hubbard, to develop the harmonic telegraph. This device, which enabled multiple messages to be sent simultaneously over the cable, was one of the most exciting innovations of the time. But Bell was more willing to develop a voice-transmitting device, which he would later call a telephone. At the end of the negotiations, the investors allowed Bell to work on both technologies, with the condition that Bell focus more on the popular harmonic telegraph. But in the end, the phone won out. Bell later stated, "If I could change the frequency of the electric current as the density of the air changes during the formation of sound, I could transmit speech by telegraph." Bell received a patent for the device on March 7, 1876. On March 10, while continuing to work in his workshop, Bell's pants were spilled with acid from the device's battery. Then Bell's famous cable transmission, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want you," makes the first successful phone call to his assistant Thomas Watson, who will hear his words. In fact, Bell wanted Watson's help. An interesting detail is that later, Bell did not want a telephone in his study, fearing that it would distract him from his scientific studies. Immediately after establishing the telephone company in 1877, Bell, himself, found himself in a nearly 20-year legal battle with other rival inventors who claimed to have invented the telephone before or recently, the most famous being Elisha Gray. However, in the end, none of the cases were successful. The phone was wildly successful, and within 10 years, more than 100,000 men in the United States owned the phone. But a few years after founding Bell Telephone Company, he quickly lost interest in managing the business side of the venture and sold his shares. In 1880, Bell, aiming to improve the lives of the hearing impaired, invested his large fortune in the establishment of a new scientific and experimental facility called the VOLTA Laboratory. The laboratory has conducted many experiments on the transmission of sound with the help of light. Apart from the telephone, one of Bell's most famous inventions was the gramophone, a device that recorded and played back sound and was patented in 1886. The gramophone was an improved and commercialized version of the phonograph invented by Thomas Edison. Coincidentally, while Bell was helping to develop Edison's phonograph, Edison developed Bell's telephone by inventing a microphone that allowed users to speak in their normal voices instead of shouting in order to be heard on calls. After the assassination of President Garfield in 1881, Bell began working on a device that could detect metal in the body and be used for surgical purposes. Bell developed a device he called the electric lead detector, a precursor to the metal detector. In 1890, Bell began to focus his work on aviation. In 1907, he founded the Aeronautical Experiment Association and helped develop flying machines such as the Silver Dart. At the age of 75, he created the world's fastest sea bus. He became one of the founding members of the National Geographic Society in 1888 and then served as its president from 1898 to 1903. Together with his son-in-law Gilbert Grosvenor, the group's magazine National Geographic became a world-famous publication. In addition, Bell launched Science magazine, which is still one of the oldest scientific publications in the world. Bell died peacefully at his vacation home on Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia, on August 2, 1922. People in Canada and the United States refrained from using their phones during Bell's funeral as a silent but powerful tribute. The French government awarded him honors and money for his service to humanity. He used the money given to establish the Volta Institute for the Hearing Impaired in Washington.